Columbia University economist and senior UN advisor Jeffrey Sachs joined Tucker Carlson, where he questioned how much the U.S. Senate actually supports Ukraine. Let's watch.
One of the most shocking things, just as someone who lived in Washington, to me, is if you ask any of the senators, as I have, who voted to keep this war going with U.S. tax dollars, how many of your beloved Ukrainians have been killed? They have no idea, and they have no interest in knowing.
And they don't care at all. And sometimes they say they don't care. Mitt Romney said, it's greatest bargain, no American lives. Dick Blumenthal said the same thing, basically. This is a great bargain, no American lives.
But isn't that evil? I mean, at some point, it's certainly hypocritical. They're telling us we're doing this for Ukraine, for our friends in Ukraine, the standard bearers of democracy. But also, don't you have an obligation to kind of care about the people you kill?
Sachs also warned National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan back in 2021 that U.S. actions could provoke Russia into war.
In 2021, Putin met with Biden, and then after the meeting, he put on the table a draft Russia-U.S. security agreement. He put it on the table on December 15th, 2021. It's worth reading. Very plausible document. I don't agree with some of it. It's a negotiable document, something you would negotiate. I thought the core of it was stop the NATO enlargement. And I called the White House myself at that point and said, don't have a war over this.
Who'd you talk to?
I talked to Jake Sullivan, and I said, don't have a war over this. We don't need NATO enlargement for U.S. security. In fact, it's counter to U.S. security. The U.S. should not be right up against the Russian border. That's how we trip ourselves into World War III. No, Jeff, don't worry. No war. There's not going to be a war.
And the Columbia professor had this to say about the way the U.S. launches itself into wars.
We are the country that makes a living by overthrowing other governments. And that's not a good vocation for us. It almost always ends in disaster, in bloodshed, in continued instability.
Yeah, he is such a gem. I think the reaction to this is commensurate with how valuable he has been to contributing to the conversation. I first got to know him when he was a surrogate for the Bernie campaign back in 2020. And I'm really appreciative of the fact that he's getting a larger and larger audience. Not that he hasn't had an illustrious career, obviously, before all of that, but now different sectors of the political audience are engaging with him, I think, because his perspectives on Ukraine and foreign interventionism more broadly, there's a new appetite for those in these new kind of Tucker Carlson and Donald Trump adjacent sections of the right.
Yeah. So on the first clip, pointing out the line that we have heard from various political officials that this is a good deal because we're fighting Russia, but we're not doing it. We're paying for it, but it's not involving U.S. troops. And look, I can understand the argument that, okay, well, if Ukraine has been invaded, if Ukrainians want to resist or fight back, they are entitled to do that. That part of it is true. But let's look at in theory, let's look at the actual situation. Ukraine has had to conscript people. It's expanded the age range at which it's doing conscription in order to keep its army full of people. Of course, when you start doing that, you start bringing in people who are not as willing to fight, who are not as capable of fighting. The psychological toll, the health toll, the mental toll on the people who've been engaged in this fighting for so long is really bad. Ukraine has had to resort to, Zelensky's government has had to resort to illiberal methods of maintaining the fight, the resistance. And again, they were invaded. It is their right to do that. But is that actually the will of the people to battle for every inch of Ukrainian territory? I think that can come under some scrutiny if that actually is the case, particularly because there are certainly questions, or was at the beginning, about whether Russia's goal is to Russia has never said that its goal is to conquer all of Ukraine, to install a Russian regime over the entire country, but to have some kind of different government or operating procedures for these specific territories that are Russian speaking and that have a lot of Russian sympathy and have not been part of Ukraine and separate from Russia for the entirety of human history, there is some friendliness for Russia there. In other parts of Ukraine, there is not. There is certainly a desire to not become part of Russia and to have closer ties with the West. And what I think there should be is self-determination for as many of these people as possible, or at least for these regions. The best way to do it, self-determination, ends up being kind of tricky because sometimes neighbors disagree on what tradition or country they want to be a part of. But we could come to perhaps some resolution, some agreement to work that out without funding a resistance that they have to resort to conscription to keep going.
Right. And stepping back just for a little bit, I think one of the broader overarching themes of this discussion was the extent to which America claims to be invested in the life, welfare, safety, and freedom of various peoples across the world, including in Ukraine. That it is standing up for democracy and liberal ideas, that it is protecting the interests of women in various parts of the world. And to think that all of that is a pretext for America advancing its own kind of neo-colonial imperialist aims across the world. And so there was this really interesting exchange where Professor Sachs is talking about the real reason that America became engaged in Serbia in 1999. And Tucker asks, so it wasn't to save the oppressed Muslim population? And Professor Sachs is like, no, it was very much to save the military-industrial complex, to have a nice base location in southeastern Europe. And that has been the kind of Sachs narrative and the kind of broader kind of left and anti-war community narrative about what's going on in Ukraine too, and the why keep expanding NATO? What was the purpose of that? Why poke the bear? Why put yourself closer and closer in proximity to a potential escalation with a nuclear power? Why do we feel so differently about how Russia reacts to our America getting closer to its borders when we had such an extreme reaction when the inverse was true in the Cuban Missile Crisis? And so it has been decades and decades where these kind of narratives either were rejected by both the left and the right, or the liberals and conservatives, during which people who had Professor Sachs's perspective were kind of dismissed as, oh, you just think America's bad. Your entire foreign policy lens is America's bad. And you still get a lot of that, by the way. But I think most people see that when you start interrogating what America is actually doing and how flimsy its motives are, that are explaining why it's doing it, that you do come to a sort of irreducible conclusion that in many, many, if not all instances, America is bad. And so even if there are children at stake, even if there are lives at stake, even if there are democratic principles at stake, the fundamental question we have to ask before America becomes involved in a global geopolitical crisis is why this one? Why are we spending money fighting this war where we get a military base out of it instead of spending money addressing a famine or simply giving mosquito nets?
I don't think America is uniquely or solely or only bad. I mean,
no,
Russia is also engaged in an imperial project.
But when you're powerful Ukraine, and you're bad, you have a lot of effects, not bad,
powerful,
and you have your own interests that are frankly against the interests of much of the world.
The governments
and that ends
of powerful
you in a position to cause a lot of harm.
Countries are coercive and are bullying smaller countries, and that's true of us.
Right.
That's true of Russia. That's true of China, and we're fighting these proxy wars with innocent people caught in the middle.
But the difference is that none of us can vote in Russia or China. We can vote in America. And so there is this increased scrutiny on what's going on here on our own proverbial roof. Stick around. More Rising coming up next.